All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our forum. I'm going to just do a brief intro and let us get started. We've got Thomas Hummel with us today, one of our priest associates, chaplain emeritus at Episcopal High School, former chair of the theology department there, teacher of history in a few institutions. And you and Ruth, your wife, are fellows and have been for many years of the Christian Heritage Institute in Jerusalem. What he's going to be speaking with us about today is the book that he and Ruth co-authored, Patterns of the Sacred, looking at patterns of pilgrimage to Jerusalem between Protestant and Russian Orthodox, and what we can kind of cultivate from the spirituality that we see there as we seek our own journeys in Christ. Welcome.
Thank you. How many of you have been to Jerusalem on pilgrimage? Okay, so I'm speaking to an already informed audience about all of this. This project, which was first a lecture, then a book, then an article, and now in a very kind of slimmed down way, a presentation for you. Anyway, this project arose in response to an experience that my wife Ruth had in the Holy Sepulchre on Palm Sunday, 1991. In the midst of the various Orthodox communities processing around the edicule containing Christ's tomb, with the local Christians and pilgrims from Greece, Cyprus, and Russia singing and dancing, a Midwestern voice asked her, "What is happening?" She began to explain the various processions, but he went on to ask, "I know it's Palm Sunday, but what does this carnival have to do with religion?" It was neither the time nor the place to respond to that question, but a version of that question has frequently been posed by Protestants viewing Orthodox Holy Week ceremonies. We decided to try and respond to that question, and this is our attempt to explain Orthodox pilgrimages to the Protestants and Protestant idea of pilgrimage to the Orthodox. And initially, when I was doing this presentation as a lecture in the 90s in Jerusalem, it was an audience of both of those communities. So this was an attempt to get that dialogue going. Our story begins, I wanted to explain the way I'm going to kind of address this, and that is that I'm posing three sets of questions to these two communities and kind of responding to what does each community do in those circumstances. So the first is, who were these pilgrims that were coming? Why did they go to the Holy Land, and how did they get there? The second section is, what did they see? What was their itinerary? And even more importantly, what sites did they find most alluring? And the third is, what did they bring home from their pilgrimages? Spiritually, what did it mean for them? And also, physically, what did they carry in their luggage when they came back? Our story begins, here's the situation in the Holy Sepulchre, so that you can kind of get the feeling of what it was that man was responding to when he asked Ruth that question. A little guidance, since you've all been there, but Jaffa on the left there, Jerusalem here, Bethlehem, then the area in which these pilgrims would be wandering. Our story begins in mid-19th century because it's then, as a result of technological advances, that is the steamship and the railroad, and geopolitical factors, that is Russia wanting to set up an influence in the Holy Land as the Ottoman Empire's power was dissolving. And to do that, they were subsidizing pilgrimages and the infrastructure to support them. So as a result of this, large numbers of English-speaking Protestants were taking advantage of the steamships, and the Russian pilgrims began to come to Jerusalem in large numbers because of these subsidies. And therefore, it's in the mid-19th century that these two communities really come into a relationship with each other. The majority, and so we're now into the first question. Who were they? Why did they come? And how did they get there? The majority of English Protestant pilgrims were clergy, their families, and their congregations, as well as people of a traveling and literary bent, the kind of quasi-tourists. In either case, their education had inculcated in them a great appreciation of the Bible, both as a religious and a literary work. These pilgrims tended to be from the more evangelical wing of the Anglican Church, or one of the non-Anglican so-called dissenting churches, usually Presbyterians or Methodists, which centered their faith on the Bible as the authorized revealer of God's will to the world. For them, salvation came through Christ, but Christ was mediated through the Bible. The Holy Land was important as the setting of the Bible. By going there, the Bible could be made to come alive in a unique way. With historical and biblical criticism beginning to raise questions about the reliability of the Bible, these 19th century English pilgrims hoped to encounter the biblical Jesus in the land in which he lived and be renewed in their faith as a result. The journey itself would be booked through the Lloyd Steamship Company, and they would dock at the port of Jaffa. This is a picture of the port of Jaffa. And here it was interesting because the ships could not get close, as you can see. There it goes. They couldn't get very close, so they had to go out in these rowboats to pick people up. And so these middle-class, prim Victorian wives would write about it, and in many cases, not just one explanation of this, but many were writing about being picked up by these hefty seamen and being thrown like a sack of potatoes to these waiting sailors in the rowboat and then brought to shore. And this was a big part of the adventure that they had. Once in Jaffa, the first job was to find a dragoman, that is an interpreter, a guide, and getting a reliable one was very important. You know, you didn't want to be cheated in some way, and you didn't want to get halfway there and have the dragoman tell you, oh yeah, if you don't double my salary, good luck to you, you'll find your way on your own. Anyway, you found a trusted dragoman, or and this was something brand new at this point, you could join one of the newly established Thomas Cook tours, which was an easy way to travel. And Thomas Cook started his travel agency in order to deal with these pilgrims. The Cook Company provided ship tickets, a dragoman, as well as a traveling tent city. Here we can see the English coming on their horses. There are the cookies. They were called cookies, who went on these Cook tours with their tents. This is the tent city that migrated with them on the trip to Jerusalem and then set up outside the walls. And in these tent cities, you would be able to have English food, English drink. They even tried to provide English beer, but it kept exploding, so they took that off the menu. And then once you left Jaffa, you had a 3-day journey on donkey, horse, mule, or foot to the holy city. In the 1890s, the railroad from Jaffa to Jerusalem was built, and so you could undertake that journey in one day. But a lot of the people who had been Protestant writers who had been on this journey by foot or on horse said that something was really missed by doing it this way. They tell about how on the second day, as they climbed a particularly high hill, they could look in the distance and see the celestial, well, in that case, it looked celestial in the sun, city of Jerusalem in front of them. It was still a long trek away, but the sight of the holy city gave hope and encouragement, and that allowed them to continue on their journey. This was seen as symbolic of the journey of life, where the occasional glimpse of the celestial Jerusalem kept one able to persevere through life. And so that was considered something that was unfortunately given up if you took the train. Okay, now we go to the Russian pilgrims, socioeconomically very different. The Russian pilgrims, unlike their English, were predominantly illiterate peasants. They were also hardy but elderly. And this was because these Russians would go to Jerusalem after their responsibility to their families, the village, and the Tsar had been fulfilled, and they were free to turn their attention to God and death. The major reason that the Russian pilgrims went to Jerusalem was to prepare for death. To visit the life-giving tomb of Christ, especially during Easter, was to partake in the miracle of the resurrection. It was both a vivid foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem and a means of grace to assure their passage into paradise. It was both a preparatory visit and a ticket to the New Jerusalem, where death would be conquered and peace would reign. There, the life-giving tomb.
The same guy is still there.
Yeah, Bishop Daniel has died, but his look-alike is still there. If the Protestants were motivated to visit the Holy Land by reading their Bibles, the Orthodox were motivated by the Divine Liturgy and the icons. In Orthodox teaching, every Divine Liturgy is a reenactment of Christ's passion in Jerusalem. Every altar, the tomb of Christ, and every church, a holy sepulchre. So why not go to the archetype where Christ's body was buried and from which it arose? Similarly, the icons which adorned the churches at home pictured events that occurred in the Holy Land. And so the icon of the crucifixion, which you are seeing here, showed Jesus on the cross, and at his feet is a fissure within which lays the skull of Adam. So what do they see when they go to Jerusalem? They go up on Golgotha, they see the icon of the crucified Christ, and then they come down and they are showed the fissure where the skull of Adam was, now taken out as a relic, but still it was seen as having been there. The icons of the resurrection, which they saw in their churches at home, would show the edicule that encased the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You could see the original. And here you have, in this case, a representation of an icon which would have had the edicule. The journey to Jerusalem for the Russian pilgrims began in their village. In order to have the funds necessary, most pilgrims needed to be sponsored by their relatives, friends, and neighbors. To sponsor a pilgrim was itself a source of grace. And while in Jerusalem, the pilgrim could and should pray for their sponsors and then bring back holy water, oils, and other blessed trinkets. The pilgrim was also assisted by the government, which subsidized their travel costs, train and ship, as well as their food and accommodation in the hostels that the Russian government built for them. Depending upon where one lived, one could walk to the port or take a train. If, however, the third-class ticket on the train was still too costly for you, you could ride crouched under the wooden bench, which was a ticket called the hare class, right? H-A-R-E, right? Like a little rabbit. You go under the bench and sit there. Once on the ship, there would be a daily service, and it was expected everyone would abstain from alcohol, which for the Russians was giving up something, during the pilgrimage, which made for a spirit of mutual support. Like the Protestants, they landed in Jaffa and were housed in the hostel. There you can see a good idea of what those accommodations were like. They, however, unlike the Protestants, even when the railroad came, felt that the journey itself was to be sufficiently penitential so that when they celebrated Easter, there was really a kind of a joyousness about it. So they continued to walk to Jerusalem. We now get to part 2. What did they see and what sights did they find most compelling? The holy sites visited by the Protestants and the Orthodox were basically the same, and you all know these sites. They all visited Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre, the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Mount of Transfiguration, Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. The difference was which were the sites they found most edifying. The Protestants, for the most part, found the Holy Sepulchre uninspiring. Frequently, they called it the icon-encrusted tomb. Many even compared it with the Jewish temple and felt it needed to be cleansed like Jesus had cleansed the Jewish temple. For the Protestants, the sites they found most meaningful were those they believed captured the landscape within which Jesus lived. So the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane were particularly appreciated. And once the garden tomb was discovered or created, it too became popular. And here's a picture of the garden tomb, right? Compared to the Holy Sepulchre. And now this, you get the sense the Protestants could come into this garden and say, oh yeah, that looks like what we see illustrated in our Bibles. They also, the Protestants also found the Sea of Galilee and the location of the Sermon on the Mount as favorites. Here, the Protestant felt that they could imagine Jesus of the Bible living, teaching, dying, and even appearing to his disciples after his death. They most loved those places where they felt that they could encounter the biblical Jesus as they read their Bibles. The Russians would seek out those sites which represented the great mysteries of the Bible, the big feasts and celebrations of the church year. So they meditated on the incarnation in the cave in Bethlehem. They contemplated the Trinity as they visited the Oak of Mamre, where Abraham had hosted the 3 angels representing the Holy Trinity. Mount Tabor was a chance to behold the Transfiguration, and Nazareth, the Annunciation. One of the Russians' favorite sites was the River Jordan. Here they would come in mass during Holy Week, carrying their shrouds. There they are, carrying their shrouds and putting them over their shoulder and jumping in the water as a reaffirmation of their baptism. They would then put those shrouds on a stick like a flag to dry off, and then these shrouds would be brought back home and they would be buried in them. Here is my shroud. It's been put onto a frame to make it a little more visible, more useful in life, not just in death. But this is a more modern Greek version of what the Russians would have had. But that's basically a sense that they're bringing home with them this kind of sign to be recognized at the resurrection that they were in that chosen few who had been to Jerusalem. The main site, however, for the Russians was the one dismissed by the Protestants, the life-giving tomb of Christ. This is the place of the resurrection, and since every divine liturgy was an effectual representation in which the faithful can participate, then the Easter liturgy, in the place where it happened, is the most potent manifestation of God's grace possible. For the Russians, this is the joyous climax of the whole journey, to commune with the resurrected Lord on the spot where it happened. You hear, this sort of the Hamiltonian, in the room where it happened, you remember that? This is the place where it happened. Here they are coming back a picture of them, the Russians coming back from the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, here overlooking the holy city. Again, the Garden Tomb. So, what did they bring home? Well, spiritually and physically. Theologically, the Protestants bring back a renewed and deepened understanding of the Bible and the life of Jesus. For many of them, there was a sense of having developed a more personal and intimate relationship with the biblical Jesus. On the more mundane level, they brought back souvenirs of all sorts, but also photographs of the holy sites. You're seeing some examples here. And many brought back memories, which they turned into books. In fact, I have 2 shelves in my library full of accounts written by these Protestant pilgrims. And that is only a portion of those published, not to mention the innumerable unpublished diaries and memoirs. Right? So the fact that they had been there was so meaningful to them that they felt they had to kind of tell this story over and over again. And they told the story in words, but they also told the story in pictures because photography was now available. My wife Ruth there is an expert in this field. She's produced or gotten arranged for these pictures, which were in our book. The Russians, however, would bring back their shrouds, representing the victory over death which they had come in search of. But also they returned to their villages as hajis. Here they appropriated the Islamic term haji, meaning a pilgrim to Mecca, and they Christianized that term. And so when they went home to Russia, they were hajis. They were people who had been to Jerusalem. And this was something that kind of gave them significance for the rest of their life in their village. And it was also written on their tombstone, right? It was something that they carried into death as well. They also brought back these blessed objects for their sponsors, especially water from the River Jordan for family baptisms. One woman even sought to bring back a life-size icon of the Virgin. Unfortunately, she didn't have the funds to buy this, so she convinced the merchant to let her have it on a spec. And she went out and laid it on the street next to her, or stood it up, and she begged for the rest of the money to be able to buy this and bring it home. And she was successful. And you can imagine what a beloved icon that must have become in her village church. Conclusion. A valuable, if simple, distinction between the Protestant and the Orthodox pilgrims is that the Protestant pilgrims tended to view a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Holy Land as a term that they kept using, a fifth gospel. They meant by this term to indicate that a visit to the Holy Land provided the exegetical tools to make the 4 canonical Gospels come alive and assisted the pilgrim in encountering the biblical Jesus in the land of his birth. Preaching the land in which he was born, he preached, he died, and was resurrected. If Christ is most clearly revealed in the Bible, then that which elucidates the Bible is itself a gift from God. The Holy Land helps make the biblical Jesus come alive, and as such serves a sacramental role. For the Russian Orthodox, they tended to view the holy sites as icons. And like icons, they acted as windows into the divine mysteries portrayed. So when they visited the Holy Sepulchre, they expected to see not the common tomb, such as you find in the Garden Tomb, right? They didn't want to have a tomb that looked like all Second Temple tombs, but they wanted a tomb that witnessed to what had happened there. They wanted a tomb that showed the significance of it. And so here you've got that place that proclaims what has happened. The life-giving tomb of Christ had to proclaim that here the God of love resurrected Jesus and promised this gift to all those who believe in him. Similarly, the cave in Bethlehem had to witness to the mystery of the incarnation. But icons are not just windows into the divine mystery, they are also doors through which believers can enter into those mysteries and be enveloped by those mysteries, and in the process be transformed. Here, this is one of my personal icons. You can see this is a Palm Sunday, but you see the Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre there being represented. And here, Doubting Thomas. Well, I have a whole theory about Doubting Thomas, who's not quite so doubting. But here, you can see him standing outside, kind of somewhat representation of the edicule. In very different ways, these two communities, in their own distinctive language, find the Holy Land, in the Holy Land, the divine presence, not just the Jesus of the past, but the Jesus of the present. We end, therefore, where we began, with the question that was asked of Ruth in the Holy Sepulchre some 30 years ago: what does this have to do with religion? The response seems to be that those who seek in Jerusalem the incarnate Jesus who was raised from the dead, in this place proclaims that message loud and clear, although in very different liturgical and iconographic languages.